get the training. So welcome again to another series of lectures. Today we're going to be going over drownings and cold emergencies. Primarily, we're going to be focusing on, ice-related problems, but we will delve a little bit into, frostbite, frost nip, et cetera, especially given the -6 degrees wind chill that it currently is. I thought this was a good time to finally go over winter stuff since winter decided to finally arrive. Hang on. As usual, I don't have any disclosures. However, I did receive assistance in developing this lecture from Kevin Richards from Springfield Township, Air Evac, which is one of the helicopter services in the area, and Doug Gallo, a friend of mine from the Akron-Canton area, who's an EMS doc. So for those of you that don't know, when I was a resident and fellow up in Michigan, I was on the dive team and was a rescue diver as well as surface support. And so we did a whole lot of ice rescues, et cetera. There's a whole lot of ice fishing that goes on, a whole lot of snowmobiling that goes on. And unfortunately, alcohol tends to be involved in both of those activities. And so what would happen is folks would be out on the ice when it wasn't necessarily safe and would fall through, et cetera. So not only did it make me a better diver because I had to learn how to ice dive, et cetera, but also made me a better doc because I got to see a lot of the things we're going to talk about here firsthand and have to rewarm people and treat them, et cetera. This is a picture of me, obviously far younger and clearly with far more hair. We would do a fundraiser. We would help out at a fundraiser for, I think it was March of Dimes, for a polar plunge where we would have people jump into the water after they'd raised a bunch of money, et cetera. And why they did that for fun, I have no idea, but we got to, get in there and keep them from going under the ice. So we're going to talk about, all the submersion related things with drownings, et cetera, how we treat these along with near drownings, and discuss some of the ice water rescue stuff that's important to know, along with going over some of the skin related problems, frostbite, frost nip, et cetera. So drowning occurs when your respiratory drive is impaired from submersion or immersion in a liquid. Now, most of the time, this is because of water, but unfortunately, people do in industrial settings drown in other things. One of the factors that helps predict outcomes, et cetera, is the type of water that somebody would get immersed in, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So we really have defined drowning into fatal and non-fatal. Okay, so fatal is obviously the person dies as a result of their drowning. That could be they die, during the actual drowning process itself, or they survive that initial insult and, die a few weeks or a few months later from pneumonia or anoxic brain injury or anything like that. That still counts as a drowning death. Non-fatal drownings is where we are able to rescue that person and they remain alive. From what I see on, most of the dispatches, et cetera, for us, we see a fair amount of non-fatal drownings every year. There's a lot of pools around, and every now and then we'll get somebody out on a lake or in the river that will cause problems. We really don't want to use the terms of near drowning, a dry or a wet drowning, secondary drowning, active or passive drowning, et cetera. Those are all somewhat confusing terms. A near drowning is that they were by a body of water that somebody drowned in. Is that a near drowning? There really isn't any such a thing as a dry or wet drowning. So we want to avoid using things like that because it doesn't help us with actual treatment or prediction, et cetera. So let's talk about some of the statistics. This is a big problem worldwide, about 500,000 drownings each year. It's likely much higher, as we talk about in most of the lectures I do. Third world countries don't have the greatest of data tracking, so the number is likely much higher. In the United States, there's about 10 deaths due to drowning reported every day. And one in five deaths is a child that's under 15. It's the second leading cause of injury-related death in children 1 to 4. Unfortunately, a lot of those are from pools or from unattended bath time. It is the leading cause of death in boys 5 to 14. For every 15 children that visit the emergency department, a lot have a visit to the emergency department. And then, as of a few years ago anyway, coastal drownings cost the US more than $273 million per year. And that's, I believe, just on medical spending, not necessarily on all the resources that go into the rescue. So this is just kind of a graphic of showing you when the highest frequency of drownings occurs. As with most things, it is a cause of concern in the younger and older age groups. We will see it at any age, of course, but it is far more likely as a child. The highest drowning rate is the 1 to 4-year-old Caucasian males, and the lowest drowning rate is the 10 to 14-year-old Hispanic female. This is the relative risk for each individual state. As you can see, Florida, not a great place, for drownings, unfortunately, because they have such a large prevalence of pools, lakes, etc. All the other states that, are cold tend to have significantly lower rates because there's less frequency of pools. It's also far more common to have someone die in a rural area from a drowning than anywhere else. So the groups that tend to be at the highest risk for drowning are males that are less than 14. There may be alcohol use associated with it, low income, poor education, rural residency. All of those unfortunately lead to no formal, swimming training or necessarily dive-related training for diving into lakes, rivers, creeks, that kind of thing. There's always, of course, aquatic exposure with risky behavior. There tends to be a lack of supervision. And then, unfortunately, we do have a fair number of people who will go swimming, sometimes independently, with epilepsy. I had a case when I was in northern Michigan of a kid who had known epilepsy. They had just driven up from Detroit, and he wanted to go swimming. And so his parents let him swim about 200 feet offshore while they stayed on the beach, fully dressed. And guess when he decided to have his seizure? Thank goodness mom was a nurse, and they were able to get out there, get him, drag him back to the beach, and were able to get pulses back very quickly, and he did just fine. But I can only imagine how scary that must have been. A lot of the drownings that we see in the United States are preventable through some relatively easy things, such as supervision, formal swimming instruction, regulations that require, fences and gates and motion detectors and things on pools. Lots of public education about not diving into water where you're not sure of the depth. And then, fences, et cetera, like we talked about for public pools as well. Toddler drownings, unfortunately, tend to occur because of a lack of supervision. And most of the time, this occurs in the afternoon or early evening hours. That's when the temperature is usually the hottest. That's when, oh, I'm going to make dinner. I can see the whole pool, from the kitchen sink. I'm just going to run in real quickly, put this on. I'll only be, in for a few minutes. Unfortunately, only 18% of toddler drownings are actually witnessed. The majority of the time, it's somebody walks outside, sees, the dark shadow in the pool, and finds the kid. Recreational boating is also a major cause. 90% of the deaths that are due to recreational boating are due to drowning. Again, I've seen multiple times where people will go to a lake that they're not very familiar with, that may have a lot of underwater weeds, etc. And they'll get out there and swim, and get tied up in the weeds and literally get pulled under from getting tired trying to get themselves out of the weeds. Had a very tragic case that I took care of where an anesthesiologist that I did not know, um, jumped in the water because his kids had gotten tied up in the weeds. He was able to successfully get them back on the boat, but he unfortunately got tied up in the weeds. The boat drifted away from where he was, and ultimately we found his body about 4 days later. Most of these, drowning related deaths from boating occur from small or open boats. It's not the big ones that have 30 people on them, etc. Diving injuries also are a fairly common occurrence. There's 700 to 800 of them per year in the United States. The peak incidence is 18 to 31 years of age, without any formal training. It tends to be, again, into unfamiliar water. And no surprise, 40 to 50% of them are alcohol related. Hey, hold my beer, I'm going to jump off of this tree. And they end up, paraplegic, quadriplegic, etc. So when we talk about drowning, there are a few factors that predict outcomes for us. The degree of hypoxia, the degree of acidosis, and then whether or not multi-organ dysfunction sets in as a complication of the drowning. So what happens when somebody begins to drown is initially people will begin to breath hold. And they do that partially because they're getting the air that they can and they don't want to let it go, but that also improves their buoyancy. It helps keep them a little bit higher. Then as soon as they begin to go under and are no longer able to keep up and keep on the surface, they will then unfortunately eventually have a reflexive inspiratory effort, where the brainstem just kind of overrides everything. And so they will release the air and try and take a gasp. That gasp of water will typically cause the larynx to spasm, to try and keep the water out of the lungs. Then as their oxygen amount in their blood begins to decrease, the laryngospasm releases. This is also when they tend to be getting pretty significant cardiac arrhythmias or bradycardia from lack of oxygen. And then just before they finally go into cardiac arrest, there's this final gasp for air that hyperinflates the lungs with liquid, and they get an aspiration-related injury. So initially there's a surprise stage where the victim typically knows that they're getting ready to drown. And if you've never actually seen any videos of somebody in the act of drowning, it's not at all like the movies. Typically these folks are so focused on getting that next breath that they're noiseless. They're not yelling. They don't have the air at that point to yell for help. And what they will do is they frequently will put their arms trying to push up on the water like it's a thing of ice that they're trying to push up to get themselves out of the water. And so they will frequently be viewed, kind of flapping their arms or grasping for things as they're trying to stay above the water. They typically will also tilt their head back, which makes sense. If you can tilt your head back, you can get better access to the air as you begin to go under. But these folks, unfortunately, don't tend to draw a lot of attention unless you know what you're looking at. Following that, they go into the involuntary breath holding, where the victim is continuing to struggle. The person is now under the water, not breathing. However, eventually they become unconscious, roughly in about 90 seconds or so. And at that point, the rest of the process occurs. They begin to become unconscious. At this point, they've stopped moving. These folks will typically begin to sink under the water, very rapidly. And then the victim sinking in the water causes, lots of problems as they begin to aspirate. Um, how fast they will sink is kind of dependent on how much air is actually in their lungs at the time, as well as what type of water it is. Salt water is far easier to float in. And so, those folks are going to tend to sink slowly. Eventually, there will be some hypoxic convulsions. These are the same kinds of things that we will see when somebody passes out. They'll describe, bystanders will describe, somebody shaking briefly, and really that's all just hypoxic drive. It is not a seizure disorder itself. The jerking is usually for a few seconds. They may appear rigid or stiff. They may froth at the mouth as part of this, although if they're under the water, you're not going to know that until they come back up to the surface. Then they lead to clinical death. If we don't get access to the patient, quickly after they go into cardiac arrest, we're not going to be able to get them, back. These are really difficult cases because typically the heart itself is perfectly healthy, other than it's been hypoxic, causing it to stop. However, the brain does not have any oxygen storage, and so we may be able to get the body resuscitated, so to speak, but we're not able to get the um, brain in time, and so they're left with profound hypoxic brain injuries, et cetera, and um, may hang on for quite a while. So as someone becomes hypoxic, they begin to get acidotic. Again, the same problem. They're not getting enough oxygen. That also means they're not letting out the carbon dioxide that's building up in their system. In addition, their body begins to use that lactic acid process to produce fuel, and so they begin to get lactic acid production, which further worsens the acidosis. As the person becomes more acidotic, and as their oxygen level goes down, their heart becomes upset and irritated with that. The human body is designed to stick to a very narrow acid-base balance. And once you veer too far away from that, lots of problems biologically begin to occur. Eventually, they lead into cardiac arrest, which further worsens the CNS ischemia and makes brain injury significantly more likely. There are other problems that can make resuscitating these folks more difficult as well. All of us have a thing called surfactant. It's one of the things that is a real problem in neonates when they're premature, because what it helps do is keep the lung alveoli from being sticky. It's almost like a soap-like product, where it allows the alveoli tissue to slide more smoothly. And as you get water down into those, obviously that dilutes that surfactant. And so the lungs will become stiff and sticky. They also will actually, the water will begin to be absorbed by the lung tissue itself, which further worsens the problem because the lungs will become very heavy and waterlogged instead of being, light and airy. This also means that once we get them out, bagging can be sometimes difficult because of the loss of lung compliance. When we get these kids in the ICU, getting their ventilator settings adjusted properly is a real problem. So as far as prognosis goes, obviously those that when we get them out are alert or, mildly confused, et cetera, have a much better outcome than those that are comatose. 35 to 60% of those requiring CPR end up dying, unfortunately. And 60 to 100% of the survivors experience some sort of long-term neurologic complication. It may be that people are just a little more forgetful. They may have a slight personality change all the way through. They may be completely bedridden, unable to interact or take care of themselves at all. So there are some other things that, of course, affect the outcome. The age of the victim, the younger, and the more healthy someone is, the more likely they are to have a successful resuscitation. How long they were under the water temperature. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. Water tonicity, which is this salt water? Is this fresh water? What kind of fresh water is it? What kind of salt water is it? If they have any associated injuries, was there drug or alcohol use? um, how quickly were we able to rescue them and then successfully resuscitate them. So once we get the call for this, obviously we may be able to get them out ourselves, or we may need to call specialized teams to come out and help retrieve the patient. So we got to get them out of the water. We've got to decide whether or not a C-spine injury could be suspected. Obviously, if it's into a shallow part of a lake or into a creek or something like that, then we probably do need to be concerned. However, being concerned about their cervical spine injury does not take precedent over getting them up and out of the water and beginning the resuscitation itself. If they have a C-spine injury, it occurred at the time of them jumping into the water and not as a result of, us maneuvering them to get them out. You want to start to try, doing some rescue breathing. In some people, if we get them very quickly after they've gone under, that may be all they need. They just need some rescue breathing to get enough oxygen into their system for their brain stem to kind of kick in and begin breathing for them again. And that's what we kind of hope for, is that we get them before they've gone into the full cardiac arrest. If the person obviously has gone into cardiac arrest, we want to start ACLS and BLS procedures. Big difference that has come out. We went over it at our protocol training this year. You know, right now we don't really have any evidence on how to best resuscitate these folks. We used to, tell everyone, if you've got a hypothermic patient, you've got to, resuscitate them more slowly, etc. And really all of that was just based on best guesses. There really isn't any literature that shows that the patients that have that kind of resuscitation, as opposed to a normal resuscitation, do any better or worse. And so the recommendation from the American Heart Association now is that we treat a drowning, hypothermic arrest exactly the same way that we treat any other regular cardiac arrest that's medical. If they are hypothermic, we need to begin rewarming them frequently, even if the lake temperature is, in the 70s, etc. If they've been under the water, they're going to be, to a certain extent, hypothermic. Water is a very good heat sink and will suck a lot of heat away from the human body. At one point, Dr. Heimlich was recommending doing the Heimlich maneuver to get, some of the fluid out of their lungs. That is not recommended. The fluid that is in their lungs is absorbed into the tissue primarily, and that is the problem. And so no amount of Heimlich maneuver is going to be able to, force the water out of the tissue. If you have somebody who is altered after you get them out, of course you want to, do your normal things. Obviously get a glucose check. If they have any debris or vomit from their oral cavity, get it out, get them on supplemental oxygen. They may require CPAP. Again, it's similar to like a CHF patient where their lungs are swollen with fluid. The CPAP will help with making the work of breathing a little bit easier, and also with helping redistribute that fluid. We want to get warm IV fluid into them. Sometimes these folks will have some degree of cardiogenic shock, and so being able to get some fluid into them that's warm, and then using stuff like a push dose epinephrine if they're hypotensive, can be beneficial of helping keep that heart moving. When we talk about cold water drowning, there are a couple of things that matter. The reality, though, is these cold water drownings, especially in a place like Cincinnati, are a markedly different thing than a cold water drowning up in, say, northern Michigan or Alaska, or Canada, etc. Um, the reality is that if you really want to talk about cold water drownings, and better outcomes, there needs to be ice on the water. You don't really see any of the beneficial effects of cold water, until the water temperature is that low. There is this thing called the mammalian dive reflex, that we'll go into here in a little bit. These folks will get severely hypothermic, and so they may appear dead, with profound bradycardia. It's important to check their pulse, for roughly 60 seconds, because they may be that bradycardic. If they are, then we need to start working on rewarming them. If they're a kid and their heart rate is less than 60, we need to start doing CPR, etc., so we can get better perfusion going. So as the person goes under the water with hypothermia, in cold water, they will begin to get obviously cold, which is going to slow down their metabolism. There are other things, though, that will also lead to hypothermia. Obviously, environmental is what we're talking about today, but sepsis can lead to this. Sometimes brain injuries will lead to this. We also will see this in the profoundly old folks, where eventually their hypothalamus isn't working properly. And so their brainstem isn't sending out the appropriate signals to regulate their temperature. Some toxins will do this, and unfortunately, some of the metabolic problems, such as hypothyroidism or low sugar hypoglycemia, DKA, means that there's simply not enough energy circulating to actually produce the heat that our cells need. So we define hypothermia as, anything from 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. It's just considered a low core temperature when you're, around 95 degrees or warmer. But mild hypothermia begins in that 95-degree range all the way down to 90. This is when folks will have normal mental status and will be shivering, trying to warm themselves back up. This is when you hope that you're encountering the person, because they tend to be cooperative, they tend to be trying to help themselves, etc. As their core temperature continues to drop, they begin to lose that ability to shiver, and will also become agitated. They may become sleepy, drowsy, wanting to just lay down, etc., until they get to about 82 degrees. Then as they become, colder and colder, less than 82 degrees, they may fall unconscious. Eventually, they will become pulseless. Somebody who is in severe hypothermia in that 75-degree range and less is going to look dead. Their tissue isn't going to be as pliable. They're going to feel waxen, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes resuscitation may be possible, although it is extremely rare. One of the things that helps us predict whether or not someone is going to survive from a hypothermic event is how easily it is for us to rewarm them. If as we begin to rewarm them, and this is over like the hours. Okay. Sorry, just knocked stuff down. As we begin to rewarm them, their metabolism should increase. If their metabolism isn't increasing and not producing heat itself, we reach a certain amount where we're putting heat in, but if the body isn't producing any heat on its own, we're not going to get them warmer than that temperature. So the colder end of this is where resuscitation is likely not going to be possible. And then death is virtually guaranteed once they are less than 56 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, they are not metabolizing anything, and as a result, the injuries that they've sustained from this hypothermic assault is going to be too much for them to handle. We lose heat through a variety of different ways. Conduction is when we're sitting on a concrete and our butt begins to get cold. So that's conducting the heat away from us. Convection is where air current is passing across the body. Today, going to be a big problem. It's going to be windy today. It's extremely cold outside. And so that wind chill is going to be up. Actually, I guess down. The wind chill is going to be down. Radiation is us losing heat from infrared rays. If you look at us under, any of our FLIR, equipment that we use for fighting fires, obviously we glow, just like a fire glows. Obviously, our temperature is a lot lower, but we are glowing all the time on the infrared spectrum, losing heat. Evaporation is one of the ways that we stay cool in the summer. We sweat. That takes heat away from us. One of the common problems when we get somebody out of the water with a drowning related incident is we've got to get them dry. So that way we can begin to, warm them, because otherwise they'll continue to just evaporate. When we breathe, we're also losing heat. And this is a combination of convection, because we're exchanging gas, okay? Radiation, because our lungs are, also glowing, on the infrared spectrum into that air mass. And then we also evaporate. As we inhale, we're putting moisture into, the air, so it's humidified. Otherwise, our lungs would get dried out. So we humidify the air ourselves, but then as we exhale, we're losing some of that moisture that has heat with it. So we begin to lose heat through evaporation as well. So this is a little bit on kind of the pathophysiology of what happens as things continue down. But again, people will become less and less responsive the colder and colder they get, eventually leading to, cardiac arrest. So as our body knows that it's becoming hypothermic, it recognizes this and is going to begin to do certain things trying to conserve heat. One of the first things it does is it vasoconstricts your blood vessels. All of us can experience that when we, go outside and it's really cold out and our hands become cold. That's because our body has recognized the fact that it's cold out. We need to keep most of the blood flow shunted, in towards your organs and your brain, and shuts down the blood flow, out to the extremities. And so that's why we come inside and our hands are pale, our face is pale, et cetera. And it takes a little bit for us to pink back up and get sensation back and things like that. Goosebumps are also one of the things that our body does, although it's not as effective as when we were, apes, because we don't have as much hair. Well, at least most of us don't have as much hair. And it will trap heat in that hair by sticking those up. We also will increase our heat production. Our metabolism will go up significantly because we're trying to produce more ATP to then generate the heat. And so shivering will help us begin to generate more heat because the muscles are moving. It also is going to cause our thyroid to release more of the thyroid hormones, which also then increases the metabolism, as more of it gets released. A couple of interesting facts, though, are, alcohol unfortunately overrides some of these, reflexes. So those old, cartoons from when we were kids of Bernese mountain dogs, with a barrel of bourbon or cognac or whatever around their neck, so that people could warm up, etc. It makes you feel warm because it vasodilates everything, but it actually makes you lose heat faster. You're overriding your body's, desire to keep the heat inside by vasodilating. That's why some people, when they have had too much to drink, will be very flushed. It's that same phenomenon. So those Bernese mountain dogs, the cognac and stuff was probably so that it made your death from hypothermia a little more pleasant, I guess. So there are some rewarming methods that we can begin doing in the pre-hospital environment. Obviously, warm IV fluids is, one of the best ways that we've got it. However, there are other things such as getting the patient dried off, getting a space blanket put over them that helps prevent further evaporative heat loss. It also helps with the infrared heat loss, and then begin putting blankets over them to provide even more insulation, etc. Those are the important things to really focus on. We don't have the ability in the field to do gastric lavage, which is where we will put warm water down into the stomach, um, let it sit for a little bit, and then pull it back out, and then replace it with fresh warm water, and then pull it back out, so that we can, kind of use that as a warming bladder. There's also, we can use ECMO devices, bypass devices to help with blood rewarming. That can only do so much as well. Sometimes we'll also even do, bladder irrigation with warm water, again, using that cavity to help warm up the interior of the body. In extremely rare cases, I've never seen this done. Sometimes a surgeon will put a catheter into their body cavity, into their belly typically, and begin circulating warm water, sterile, of course, around the tissues there to help rewarm from the inside. Ultimately, though, we can do all of this stuff if the person's metabolism is done and is not, and they're not beginning to produce their own heat. We reach a limit where we can't put enough energy into the human body to warm it back up without killing tissue. Um, and that's one of the ways that we know, look, we've been trying to rewarm this person for a couple of hours. We've kind of hit this mark, and we're not really budging from there. We can't go up any higher on any of the temperatures that we're using. If we hit that and they're just kind of sitting there, we know that we've reached kind of that limit, and the resuscitation is not going to be successful. Unfortunately, a lot of the drugs, are not necessarily as effective, when it is cold. Again, there's some acidosis typically accompanying this, which throws that stuff off. Defibrillation is also not likely to be effective. However, again, the evidence on that is significantly less than, you know, uh, regular ACLS, procedures. Sometimes when we resuscitate these folks, we will see this thing called a J wave or an Osborne wave, and it is this kind of hump that occurs late in the QRS, and will sometimes almost look a little bit like an ST elevation. However, it's a hump. It tends to not be, as flat as, an ST elevation MI will be, and it will be present in multiple leads, as opposed to just, an anatomic lead like 2-3 and AVF. It'll be in, a lot of the various leads. So managing these folks is, again, getting them into a warmer environment, getting the wet clothing off, prevent further heat loss. Again, my recommendation is, space blanket, followed then by multiple other blankets. If you happen to have one of those active rewarming systems, I'm not aware of any of you guys that carry them, but some places in the wilderness will have bear huggers like they use at the hospital. Putting that on is also helpful. You want to avoid rough handling because they are, very sensitive. The tissue is more friable, may tear more easily. In addition, jostling, may cause cardiac arrhythmias to worsen. Get them on the cardiac monitor, of course. Try and get some sort of a good core temperature. Again, as we talked about it at the protocol review last month, core temperature is really only reliable when you obtain it via the rectal route. Again, I'm not aware of any of us that are carrying rectal thermometers. So this would be one where we just do the best that we can with trying to get some sort of a temperature on them to give us an idea. We also don't want you to put heat packs on the patient. The heat packs will warm up enough that it can burn them, even though it may not look like it's burned initially. It's the same thing that will happen with heating pads. If an elderly person is sitting on a heating pad all day, even though the temperature itself is not enough to cause a burn on its own, it's the combination of temperature plus time plus pressure that will lead to skin breakdown and cause burn-like injuries. Of course, if we have the ability to, warm their fluids, great. the problem is that none of us really are carrying IV bag warmers. We had to in northern Michigan because if your truck was outside and it didn't have a bag warmer, the normal saline would freeze. So we did have them on every one of my ambulances up there. Down here, the old trick of throwing them up on the dashboard with the defrost on, it really doesn't warm the fluid up enough to be of any benefit. Plus, then you also have to think about they've got all that IV tubing, to go through, and that IV tubing, just like the plumbing in your house, when you first turn your hot water on in the morning before you take a shower, all that water is coming out cold. It takes a while for the fluid to warm up, to get from your hot water tank. It's the same kind of thing with IV fluid. It's losing a lot of heat, as it travels down that long tube. So again, to manage this stuff, get them out of the cold, get them dry, start getting them covered so that you can prevent further heat loss. And then, as people progress and get worse, then you're going to need to start doing more things, more aggressive warming, warm IV fluids, etc. If somebody is conscious, it is okay to give them, warmed liquids to drink. Um, Typically, again, this is not something like I'm not advocating you stop at a gas station and get them a hot chocolate on your way to the hospital or anything like that. It's more one of those things of if you happen to have it, great. But don't stop at a Starbucks and get everybody a round of drinks to warm up before you go to the hospital. We talked about those. So again, always resuscitate until until you've warmed them up adequately. You're not dead until you're warm and dead, unless you really are dead, in which case we're not going to be able to warm you up enough. And hypothermia can cause, an absence of vital signs. All right, we've been at it for about 40 minutes. The next piece of this is kind of the cold related injuries, and then we're going to get into some of the ice related stuff. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. So let's have everybody be back at 9:52, actually 9:53, and then we'll hammer out the rest of this. All right, guys, I've got 9:53 on the clock, so we'll go ahead and get started and finish this out. So the next couple of things that we're going to talk about are cold injuries that will be sustained, and they may or may not accompany hypothermia. They tend to be localized, tissue damage, etc. So chilblains is a localized inflammation, and it's usually from a damp cold that's above freezing. So people who do ice fishing and things like that may get this if they get their gloves wet and their gloves are, up against the skin for too long. It causes a localized reaction. It'll usually be itchy, swollen, reddish or purple. And is very localized. It's most common in, your fingers and toes, etc. It really tends to not cause any permanent damage. It really is a localized thing. The treatment is as simple as you dry them off, you warm them up, and you elevate the extremity. This is also what was a major problem in World War I, hence the previous slide having a talk about trench foot. Unfortunately, what happens is if your feet are wet for a long period of time, like the soldiers had in World War I, not only does it set up a breeding ground for bacteria, but that eventually begins to wear the tissue down. The tissue becomes extremely moist, and as anybody can attest, when you have really moist and wet skin like that, it's far easier to tear it, and so they would get injuries to their feet, etc., and then get infections of them. It would also cause this inflammatory response, and so it was extremely painful. At one point during the war, there were more soldiers being taken off the front lines because of trench foot than enemy fire. It's that big of a problem. So that's why the militaries around the world, um, really had to figure out a solution. And so we didn't see nearly as much of it during World War II, as we did during World War I, because some of the technology to insulate and waterproof your boots had improved. Trench foot is what this looks like, and also the thing that contributes to it, is tight fitting boots. So somebody who's got inappropriately fit, shoes will also develop this. In some cases, some tissue loss will occur. That generally occurs because of infection, or because the tissue is so macerated and torn that it really isn't able to close itself back up and heal. Um, we will see this, and in fact, the only cases of this I've ever seen have been in the homeless population. They will get their feet wet in snow like we've got right now, and even if the temperature warms up above freezing, if they stay in those wet shoes, wet boots, etc., they still will develop this condition and can cause significant problems. Frost nip is what I think most of us experience on a fairly routine basis. I know that yesterday morning when clearing off my driveway, my fingers got frost nipped. But it's this temporary cold-induced paresthesia, where you lose the sensation in your fingertips, etc., temporarily while things are cold. You may or may not be pale, like in this picture. That finger is pale, but that resolves on its own with rewarming. You put on gloves, you go back inside, something along those lines. The problem goes away. It can be painful if it's affecting a whole lot of your digits, but it does not cause permanent damage. So you're not going to have any tissue loss or anything like that. Frostbite is the next layer of progression. So we've developed frost nip. The frost nip hasn't been rewarmed. So now we're causing actual tissue ischemia. And if it's not resolved, then we're going to begin to cause, freezing, etc. So this is a much worse injury than frost nip. This usually is associated with alcohol or drug use. This is the person that, passes out, drunk in their friend's front yard when it's snowy, and wakes up in the morning and, their fingers are frozen, their toes are frozen, their nose is frozen, etc. These folks may also have a psychiatric illness, preventing them from recognizing the fact that, they're injuring themselves. We also will see this with prolonged exposures. So even without alcohol, drug use, psych illness, et cetera, this is a common concern in mountaineering, wilderness, things like that. Because especially when you're mountaineering, et cetera, you need your hands, you need your feet to be able to actually get yourself out of the situation that you put yourself in. And so, frostbite can cause significant problems with a rescue. So this is, to put this kind of in burn analogies, frost nip is kind of your superficial frostbite. Is you're now getting into the, deeper tissues. You've gone through most of the layers of the skin, and deep frostbite is you're now down into the fat, muscles, tendons, potentially even bones, depending on how long you're exposed to the cold. Um, you know, an adage that we had in Michigan, because we would see this, especially in our homeless population, was, these people's tissues would freeze in December, and we would remove whatever was still there in May. And the reason for that is because even though, injuries can look really, really, really significant, as long as the dead tissue isn't getting infected, there's still a possibility that the body is going to be able to regenerate something. And instead of, in this case, us having to remove essentially all of their fingers right at the palm, it may be that instead we only have to remove the tips of a couple of fingers, or things like that. Because as time goes by, the body is able to get rid of the dead tissue, begin generating new tissue. So we're instead able to work with like stumps. Um, getting them infected, at that point, they don't have blood flow. They have to come off, but we will do everything we can to keep those tissues from, getting infected and give us a chance to see if any of it's salvageable. A big key is when people are getting frostbite, a lot of the injury is occurring because of ice crystal formation. It's why we haven't been able to successfully freeze a rat and wake it back up, um, you know, a day later. Um, it's because ice crystals as they form are very sharp, and it's like a million knives from the inside of the cell, splitting the cell membranes, et cetera. And so it causes a lot of tissue. If we do a freeze thaw, freeze thaw, freeze thaw cycle, it causes a lot of tissue damage because not only is it, one set of knives, but every time you refreeze, it's a new set of knives that are destroying tissue. It's why if you take a really good steak and you throw it in your freezer drawer for a year, and it goes through a freeze thaw and gets frost burnt, it's the same thing. It's been frozen thawed, and it just isn't good. It's the same thing with live tissue as well. So when we're responding to, the scene of any of these drowning or cold water emergencies, et cetera, we need to get some general information. Where were the victims last seen? Especially if this is going to be, kind of a search with, the resuscitation, et cetera. Is water involved? What kind of clothing was the person wearing? What's the temperature? Do we have a temperature if they're in the water of what the lake is? Even if it's just simply there's ice, there's no ice. Obviously, day or night matters. We're really fortunate now that we've got, the drone team that has, some of the heat sensitive picture ability, that I know has been instrumental in saving. I'm aware of at least two people. I believe it maybe even more of that, where the drone's heat sensitive cameras were able to pick up somebody where we otherwise would not have been able to see them. And then getting the appropriate, resources going. Do you need boats? Do you need the dive team? Do you need ATVs? It's not as big of a problem here, but do you need snowmobiles? In northern Michigan, literally, the guys would happily bring their snowmobiles in when we had to go out on the snowmobile trails, et cetera, and try and find somebody who had gotten into a crash or, whatnot. So, try and get this information as much as possible, even if, the person is not that informative. Try and get whatever little bit of information you can from them, et cetera. So when we talk about water related things, we have to be worried about, some of these various types of water features that are there for water engineering, such as low head dams, strainers. Are there rocks, bridges, channels, rapids, any flood control basins that they could have been pulled off, the side into, debris basins? Is it low water? Is it flooding water where the area of the water has significantly increased because it's spilled out of its banks? All that really matters. So when we talk about ice rescue for EMS, this is an ALS run. We're lucky that's pretty much all we have anymore. The patient is going to be hypothermic. The cold water is going to make them hypothermic very quickly. Is there going to be a dive reflex? Do we need to get, mutual aid coming, so that one group of people is focusing on the, rescue part, and, a fresh set of providers is, there to take over and begin the resuscitative part of, the call? Do we need to get air care, scrambled? Is this somebody that would benefit from being taken down to University of Cincinnati straight from the scene so they can do more invasive active rewarming than your local facility may be capable of? So some of the survival factors for surviving from a cold water immersion injury are water temperature, as we talked about. the colder the water, the better. But really, to get that true protecting the brain, it needs to be ice water. How long the person has been in the water. Obviously, somebody who's been in the water for longer is less likely to survive. How old is the person? Kids are far more likely to survive cold water, ice water immersion injuries than the elderly. How good is the CPR once we get them out? What type of water is this? You know, if there was a significant ingestion of sewage water, et cetera, that's going to create problems. So we may be able to get them through the drowning, but they ultimately die because of, aspiration pneumonia and things like that. How much of a struggle was there? Did they sustain additional injuries trying to push themselves out and back up onto the ice, et cetera, after they began to go under? So, places where we will see this, unfortunately, are, ice fishing, kids playing. I know that's going to be a big concern. This weekend is, there's ice forming on a lot of these ponds. People around here don't know how to recognize, safe ice, or safer ice, I should say. And so there are going to be people that do something stupid, trying to walk out on ice that really isn't going to ever be capable of supporting them. Sometimes this is skaters, sledders, snowmobilers. We would see this all the time where, it'd be towards the end of the winter up north, and up there, literally you can drive a truck out onto the ice, in a normal year. But as the ice begins to melt, some areas of it will melt faster than others. And so if you're on a snowmobile and you're tearing across a lake that otherwise is flat and white, you don't notice that, oops, there's open water typically until you hit the open water. And then it's a matter of trying to get yourself back out and safe, and getting somebody to come rescue you. We also will see this in the elderly, where the elderly will wander away, and unfortunately will get hypothermic, or will stumble into a lake or a river, et cetera. And then, of course, the substance abuse related stuff. I do have a video here, that last time I tried to share it via Zoom, did not work well. So I'm just going to leave the link in the slides. So I'd encourage you to go watch this video. But this guy goes over this phenomenon called the torso reflex, which is when your body goes into ice water, you begin to have this rigidity that occurs. And what happens is, all of a sudden your muscles are going to tense up very quickly. Similar to, like, if you've ever gotten a cold water balloon thrown on your back, you kind of go, like that. It's a much more pronounced version of this. And unfortunately, you also will tend to do a deep inspiration at the same time. And so these folks will frequently inhale water if their nose and their mouth goes under the water when this reflex is occurring. And so that then can lead to even further problems, because now they're in this drowning state, not just hypothermic ice related injury. The big thing is, no ice is ever safe ice. Even when we were up in northern Michigan, we had a lot of precautions in place. We would do boreholes fairly frequently, so that we knew what the ice thickness was at various parts. We would cordon off areas that were thinner than we wanted to. And we had a fairly sizable safety margin as well, to be able to safely, or more safely, work out there. Even though, we're on, something that's supposed to be able to support us, et cetera, mandated that everybody is in appropriate equipment, such as a life vest, et cetera. You have to have gone through, additional training to be able to get out there. I'm not really going to spend a whole lot of time on the various types of ice, but there are various types of ice. Frazil is probably what most of the lakes around here are doing, which is this very erratic ice crystal formation. It kind of is that oily sheen that we see on lakes as they begin to freeze, because it's not very well organized. It's not really, bound together yet. And so as a result, it'll begin to crumble just like you see in that bottom picture. Clear ice is when there's been a nice long hard freeze, and when you pull the block out, it will have this clear appearance. That is ice that has really stuck well to each other, doesn't have a lot of air in it, and is the strongest kind of ice that's out there and available. It may have a tint to it based on whatever kind of water it was pulled up from. Snow ice is a dangerous ice if you don't know what to look for, because what happens is you will get this clear ice of a certain layer, but then you'll get a bunch of snow piled on top of it. And as the snow kind of melts with the sunlight, etc., and refreezes, it's not refreezing the same way that the lake ice has frozen, and so will cause problems. Um, and unfortunately, if you don't know how to recognize that, hey, there's snow ice on top of this ice, you may think that, oh, look, the borehole looks good. I've got plenty of ice here. As you can see in this example, you can see right there, there are three distinct layers. So we had the normal ice formation, followed then by two decent sized snowfalls that then melted and created snow ice. Layered ice is pretty dangerous as well. It's when, ice blocks have broken off. We will see this at the edges of lakes that have significant wind and things like that. It'll have a striped appearance where it's kind of, pushed up on itself, refrozen, pushed up on itself, refrozen. And that can be pretty dangerous because you don't really know what the thickness is that you're working with. Um, ice strength and thickness is going to vary from, one end of a lake to another. The shallower areas, etc., are actually more dangerous because they are closer to the ground. The ground is the same temperature. That's why every cave on Earth is about 55, 56 degrees. That's just the natural temperature of the Earth at the top. And so if that is close to the edge, like at the edge of a lake, it's going to be preventing ice formation, at the edges. And so out in the core of the lake, in the center of the lake, may have the highest ice thickness. Also, when streams or rivers or things join together, the moving water is also going to prevent thick ice from forming. And so we will also see people sometimes fall through where, they normally are going across the lake, but they don't realize that there's a stream that comes in, over there because everything is whited out, um, and you don't know the stream is there, and you'll go across that section and it's weak because it's got flowing water underneath the ice, and so the ice isn't as thick there. This is kind of a rough guide. Literally we had one year when I was living up there where we had ice that was, I think it was 9 feet thick. The ice fishermen were really mad. It was an absurdly cold year, and the bay, iced over to the point where people were driving full-size trucks, out onto it, etc. And there was very little danger of anything bad happening, because in some portions, especially close to the shore, the ice literally went from the surface of where the water would normally be all the way down to the bottom. So there was really no water. And then this is what you don't want to see happen, is you're hauling your shack back after catching a whole bunch of fish and you catch the wrong area. So again, no ice is safe ice. Very important that if you're going to do any ice related things that you get appropriate, certification, verification of your skills, etc., because you can get into a world of hurt very easily, especially if, you're falling into ice, in a relatively small area and you slip under the ice. It's very, very dangerous. So, all right. Any questions?